Good afternoon. Welcome to the City Council workshop for November 17th, 2021. This meeting is being held in accordance with guidance from the governor. All persons, whether having received a vaccine or not, are required to wear a face covering. Items listed on the agenda may be taken out of order. Two or more agenda items may be combined, and any item on the agenda may be removed or related discussion may be delayed at any time. With that, I will call the meeting to order. We will begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We'll begin with our first public comment period. Anyone wishing to speak in public comment, you will have up to 5 minutes for items that are listed on the agenda. As always, we ask that people be civil and concise. There's also the possibility to call in during the public comment period or to have submitted comments prior to the meeting via email. Is there anyone in council chambers that would like to speak during public comment? Please state your name.
Good afternoon, Mayor and City Council members. My name is Barbara Paulson, and I'm a member of Nevadans for the Common Good. It's a broad-based community organization throughout Clark County, and we have 3 member institutions here in Boulder City. We call ourselves the Boulder City Cluster, and we work specifically on Boulder City issues. We appreciate everything that the Boulder City Fire Department does to keep us all safe and to provide emergency medical service to our residents. We are in support of adding a new substation to the fire department so they can continue to provide their high-quality services throughout their entire service area. Item number 3 on the agenda addresses the structure of a new facility and presents several options. Our preference is option number 6, which is to build a joint fire station public health facility using CIP and ARPA funds. The Southern Nevada Health District has a wide range of services for the residents of Clark County, and they have branch facilities in multiple communities throughout the county, but none in Boulder City. And we do need one here. To avail themselves of Southern Nevada Health District's programs and services, Boulder City residents must go to Henderson and sometimes often all the way to Vegas. Over the last 6 months, the Boulder City Cluster of Nevadans for the Common Good has talked to and listened to a wide variety of community leaders, city leaders, and residents throughout the city about many of the concerns that they're facing. In essence, what we ask people is what keeps you up at night. And then we listen to what they have to share with us. And one of the things that we've heard over and over again is about health-related needs and the availability of services locally, where they were very often stated as things that are lacking and things that are really needed. Having a public health facility attached to that new substation could be a great benefit to this city, to all its residents, and could start to bring very needed public health services to this city. So we strongly encourage you to stand in support of option 6 for the new structure. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak in public comment? All right, we will take comment via phone call. Anyone wishing to call in, the phone number is 702-589-9629. Again, this is our initial public comment period for the City Council workshop. Anyone wishing to call in, the phone number 702-589-9629. Madam City Clerk, were there any email comments received?
None received.
Thank you. Hearing no others for public comment, then we will close the public comment period. And we will move to item number 1. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you. Today I'm going to turn it over to Chief Gray to handle all of the items on the agenda. And I will say that he's put a lot of work into this and based all of the presentation today on data and his professional opinion. And as always, the level of public safety and fire and EMS services within the council's latitude and decision-making, policy-making process. So, Chief Gray.
Thank you, sir. Just a little background for where this started. When I showed up here in January of 2020, I realized we didn't have a community risk assessment, which is really the foundation for how you do public safety. Excuse me. My goal was to have it done by this last summer. We all know in March of last year, things changed quite a bit and changed our schedules. So we continue to work on that through the pandemic. We did finish it this last summer, or this summer here, I think back in August. And so we sent out a copy of the risk assessment to all the council. We wanted to talk about that briefly a little bit today, and then what some of our conclusions were, some of the things we found as a result of doing that risk assessment. So that's really the reason for being here. So I thank you for making time for us. So I just want to do an overview first of our risk assessment. The second thing we'll talk about is some gaps in our response area that came to us during the risk assessment. Have a discussion about a future fire station potential and additional staffing, and then we'll have some time for question and answers. I discussed with the mayor, we have 4 agenda items that are just all discussion items. So the way the PowerPoint's written is they're just in one. So if at any point there's questions, feel free to stop me, and if not, we can talk at the end. So the first part of the community risk assessment is we look at what risks are specific to Boulder City. It's real easy to just say we're just going to do fire calls. The reality is every city in our country is unique based on topography, demographics. There's a lot of different factors that are specific to our community, things that we need to know about. So the first thing we look at is fire suppression. In our town, we have a range of houses, as you know, like in the historic district, a lot of 1,000 and 1,500 square foot homes. We have a lot of 5,000 square foot custom homes around the city. None of that stuff's really unique. But what we did find as we were driving the city is we have about 45 homes that are built up on hills or on long driveways that fire trucks can't get to. Just the way they were constructed, and back when they were constructed, it just wasn't caught. So that was one of the things that was a result of this risk assessment. And what we did for that is we actually came up with a new deployment strategy so that we can actually now reach those homes. What it really came down to is we got a pickup truck, put some extra hose in it, did some new training and policies, and that allows us now to deploy hose to houses that we couldn't reach before. But had we not done this risk assessment, we wouldn't have even known they were out there. So that was one of the good benefits. Another thing that we noticed as we were looking through our risk assessment is we've seen quite a few highway vehicle fires. I'm sorry, I'm gonna take this off, I can't. So semis and stuff traveling I-11. Since I've been here, we've had 4 semi wrecks. We've had several fires. Our guess is because of the hot temperatures and the rolling hills coming in and out of the city has caused some of that problem. So that's been a demand on some of our resources. So we've made some changes in how we respond to those semis. It involves some equipment, some training, so that we can better do that safer. The next thing we look at is emergency medical services. That's the primary call type in our city, which is unique. I mean, around the country, about 70% of calls are EMS related. Our city is unique in that we have double the population of people over 65 as the national average. So the national average is about 16%. We have about 32% of our population is over that age group. We know that that'll drive some of our call types. We'll see more falls, we'll see more cardiac related, strokes, things of that nature. So that, again, another important thing to learn from the risk assessment. Technical rescue is an area that really wasn't covered before I got here. And so during our risk assessment, we looked at what specific risks affect Boulder City. And auto extrications are a big one with the 3 roads that come through town. Rope rescue is important for us with the rocks around town, with the zip lines, and obviously with assisting over at the dam. So that's something we've been focusing a little bit of attention on. Not a lot because it's not as big a risk as others, but we are focusing on that. And then we have some limited water rescues. Most of the water risk is in the drainages during the monsoons, but I've been here for a year and a half, and I've heard we have monsoons. I just haven't seen one. So, but we are preparing in case it ever does rain again. So, and then the fourth thing that we didn't have a presence. We didn't have a hazmat team when I got here, and so every city has hazmat risk. And if you have a road that comes through town, you have a hazmat risk. Well, we have 3 roads. I-11 is one. We just have the first piece of it, but eventually I believe it's supposed to go from Reno, Nevada to Nogales, Mexico. And so it's going to be a major transportation hub. And so typically across those interstate highways, you have all different hazmat classes going across that. So it's important that we're prepared to deal with that. But we also started looking at all of our fixed facilities. And our solar farms actually do have quite a bit of acids, and they also have quite a bit of toxic oils. One in the area of 4.3 million pounds of it. So it's a lot of this material that we have to be prepared to help deal with. And so we've shifted our focus a little bit. We've got some members trained as hazmat technicians. We've started to purchase some equipment. Again, we're not going to build a level 1 hazmat team because we don't have that risk in Boulder City. But we do have a risk that requires some kind of response. And so that's really what we're working on. One of the things that we were committed to doing really is changing the philosophy of we'll just wait for Henderson to come and do it, to where we're going to start working and doing our best to get things underway and still have Henderson come help us, because a lot of these things get too big for a small department. And so we'll still need help. But I didn't think it's okay to make our citizens wait for 20 minutes while someone else comes to do it. So we're really focusing on making sure we can start. So the next thing we did, and part of the process is requires us to break our city up into planning zones. And so some people use just generic numbers, police beats. It was our opinion that it's more beneficial to break the city up into neighborhood zones, into recognizable areas, so our community, our citizens will know if we have a concern in Del Prado and we talk about Del Prado. If you live in Boulder City, you know where Del Prado's at. If I say beat 2B, that means nothing to anybody outside the fire department. And so that was one of our changes, is really to break our city into 14 smaller neighborhood groups. The other advantage of this is when we offer community risk reduction efforts, instead of saying everybody gets the stop, drop, and roll class, that doesn't make sense, or everybody gets industrial training. We can actually break it down by our neighborhoods based on who lives there, and based on calls specific to those different neighborhoods. We track our data now by neighborhood, so we can tell you how many calls happen in Del Prado. We can tell you how many happen up in the industrial area. It also allows us to focus, like on our senior communities. We can deliver special National Fire Academy classes to our senior communities, but not to our industrial communities. They need some different classes. They need a safety class or a fire extinguisher class. It allows us to kind of break up what we do based on where the risk is located. And we just get more money or more bang for our money. So. The next part in our gaps and response area really comes down to response times. And a lot of people don't fully understand why fire departments set the response time number that they do. And so the first thing I want to talk about is the elements of response time. And so the National Fire Protection Association has a standard, NFPA 1710, and that's really the standard that drives most of what we do as a fire department. It tells us how we should staff our units and how we should plan for different incidents and how we should respond. And it really breaks response time down into 3 pieces that we can control somewhat. The first one is our dispatch processing time, and that's how long it takes from the time you dial 911 until a dispatcher contacts the fire department. And so in our city, we typically have 1 or 2 dispatchers on duty, and they're managing a lot of things. And so when you call, they have to help calm you down, help determine what your issue is. Is it a police issue? Is it a fire issue? Get a location, and to start to gather enough information to send the right resources. And so according to NFPA 1221, which is the standard that guides them, they have 80 seconds to do that 90% of the time. And so we've been working with dispatch really closely. Chief Chesser and Ruby meet regularly, and they've done a really good job of starting to chip away at and shorten that time down to get it closer to the standard. And some of it's through some training, and some of it's through just policies and procedures and just kind of constantly tracking that. So that's been a benefit. We've seen a reduction in our time through there. The second piece is turnout time. And that's the amount of time it takes from the time the dispatch alerts the station until the wheels are moving on the fire truck. And so the standard is 60 seconds for a medical call and 80 seconds for a fire call. They give you a little bit more time for a fire call because sometimes you have to get your gear and put it on the truck. And again, so same thing there. We came here and because nobody ever tracked this data before, the data was longer than it needed to be. And so we do monthly checks. I say we, but it's really Greg. He does monthly data and reminders to everybody in the department, hey, you're getting better this month, or hey, you slipped from last month, and we're constantly chipping that time away. But between the first 2, just since we've started working on this process, I believe we've reduced our response times by about 2.5 minutes. So it's making good progress, which seconds are critical in a cardiac arrest, as we're going to talk about in a minute. So 2.5 minutes coming off is a big accomplishment. The third piece is the travel time. The standard is to be 4 minutes travel time from any location from your fire station. That's the standard that's set by NFPA. It's also the standard set by ISO, which is the Insurance Services Office, and that's who sets fire service ratings for most cities. And so that's really what started our conversation. So once we mapped out our city, we got with GIS and asked them to run a GIS model from our station, 4 minutes in every direction. And then I'll show you in a minute, we'll have a map that shows you what areas those cover. But the reason it's so important is the total response time of 6 minutes and 20 seconds that's based off of 2 different factors. The first one is flashover. So flashover is a phenomena that happens in a fire. A lot of people might think of it as like backdraft. It's really not. But basically, if a fire starts in the corner of your room, like in a Christmas tree, the fire goes up the wall and across the ceiling, and it starts to build heat. Quite often that heat, if you get it quick, you can put it out, and it's not a big deal. But if that's left unchecked for a few minutes, that heat starts to come down. When the whole room reaches 1100 degrees, everything ignites at once, and you just see one big fireball. That's not a survivable situation for somebody that's inside there. So just as an example, human skin burns at 118 degrees. Our firefighting gear chars at 572 degrees. So in all of our protective equipment, if that happens when we're in a fire, we have 22 seconds to get out before our firefighting gear fails. So it's important to us that we try to get to a fire before flashover occurs. Flashover typically occurs between 4 to 10 minutes. Usually it's closer to 6 to 10 minutes in a fire. Again, and that's the other important thing to remember about a fire is most people don't find a fire as soon as it starts. If they did, they'd go step on it or put a bucket of water on it and it would go away. They're in the other room and they find it when the alarm goes off because the fire went up and the smoke came across and now it's too big to put out. And so sometimes that recognition can add a minute or 2 to the time. So the second part, and I think the part that's even more relevant to Boulder City, is cardiac arrest survival. So according to the American Heart Association, when your heart stops, which is what cardiac arrest is, within 4 to 6 minutes your brain starts to die. And there's a 10% reduction in survival for every minute that electrical shock delay happens. So it's really important when we look at response times, that's where that 6 minute number that you see comes from, is the goal is to try to get on scene before these 2 really important things happen. So the maps here are kind of small. We do have maps up there if people from the audience want to look at them. But what we did is when we ran the data, we started to look at what part of our city was covered from Station 121 at 1101 Elm and what part of our city is outside of that. And as you can see from the map, majority of Lakeside, Del Prado, and then the area that we refer to as Bee Hill or San Felipe is all outside of that 4 minute travel time. We also have a little area by the airport, but The other thing we did is we overlaid our incidents for the year. And for that, and that was from October of 2020 to October of 2021. And that allowed people just to see not how many calls we had, because that doesn't depict a good example. That it just shows where they're falling at. So they're falling all through the city. In doing the data analysis, we have 6,900 plus residents that live outside of our 4-minute travel time. And we also looked at the number of homes. We have 6,500 residential facilities in our city. We have 3,065 that live outside of that coverage area. So it's not a small thing. It's not affecting a small group. It's affecting about half. I think the most current census has us at 14,880, or 14,880 is what our total population is. So the next thing we talk about is the potential for a station. And when a station is put in place, two things are considered typically. Now, prior to about 30 years ago, the main deciding factor for where you put a fire station was where the city had free land. And that sounds crazy, but that's really what it was. Sometimes they'd put them too close or too far apart. It was really where they could get land. Over the last 30 years, the more modern fire departments have pivoted, and their decisions are all based on risk and data. And they're doing things like GIS studies and trying to see where can we put stations to get the most benefit for our community. But when they do them, they look at two things. They look at distribution of resources and concentration of resources. The distribution of resources is that you have fire stations spread across your city to get a unit there fast enough to be able to start an intervention, and they're concentrated as such that you can get the rest of them where they need to be for the effective response force. And so everything that we do has an effective response force. And again, that's based off of NFPA 1710. And that's basically, they go through it, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, and tell you, based on the initial actions that have to happen, how many people you need for each kind of incident. So it's all really, it's planned out for us from the National Fire Protection Association. So when we asked the GIS to run some data, we actually picked two hypothetical locations and asked them to run 4-minute travel times out from those if we were to get an additional station. One of them, we picked a location near the Chamber of Commerce, just because we saw there's two areas that seemed to be really exposed. One area was the lakeside area, and it seemed like we have the majority of our senior population living up there in the trailer parks and in the RV parks and stuff, and so that seemed like a greater risk out of the two areas that were most open. So you can see from the map, it shows that really good coverage over the lakeside and a little bit of overlap, which again, the overlap happens in the historical district, which is not a bad thing to have overlap. A lot of cities will actually deploy their resources where they have overlap to where almost every area is covered by two. So having a little bit of overlap is not seen as a bad thing at all. This potential station here would increase the protection to 4,474 residents and 1,978 homes over what we have right now. Again, neither of the options that we had available would cover everything. It's not possible to get 4 minutes by putting one station somewhere. The other station option that we looked at was in around the library. This one here actually would increase protection to 3,521 residents and about 1,470 homes. So again, both of these were just things that we put in there as potential places that we could put a fire station that would help kind of close these gaps. So on the staffing discussion, as we were talking about before, when I talked about that critical tasking or that effective response force, a critical task analysis is done for every department, and it's based on the risks that you find in your community. So we're working now on a document called a standard of cover document. It should be released in the next month or two. And that document will be available for the public to see too. And it has an overview of the risk assessment, but then it goes through and does this critical task analysis. It says, based on the risks in Boulder City, here's how we need to respond to each risk. And so, for instance, NFPA 1710 says you need 16 firefighters at a structure fire. So we don't have 16 firefighters. So what we need to do is we'll need to go through our risk assessment, our critical tasking, and we'll say, well, based on what we have today, here's what our first unit would do, here's what our second unit would do, and go down and list them, and then here's what Henderson's going to do. And then we'd have to determine how much time it's going to take to get Henderson in here, and that will be what our effective response force time will be, if that makes sense. And so, same thing like high-risk events. High-risk events typically take regional and sometimes state resources, and so those ones can be a lot higher numbers. So a lot of times you'll see a fire department, they might have a critical task analysis for a high-risk hazmat that needs 80 people. That doesn't mean we have to hire 80 people. It just means to make that risk go away, we have to get 80 people there. And so, and we have to talk about how we're going to do that. And so that's part of what that document does. Another thing that I wanted to talk about, in 2016, ISO, which is that Insurance Services Office, came to Boulder City and did their 5-year rating. At that time, Boulder City was an ISO 2, and they rated them down to an ISO 4. And one of their findings was that Boulder City should have 2 fire engines based on the fire flow requirements of our city. And so the way they calculate that is they look at how much water a fire engine can pump. And then they look at what the max fire flow needs are. Our fire engine that we just bought is a really good fire engine, and it's got a bigger pump than most. It's got a 1,750 gallon pump, I believe. Our requirement is 2,500 gallons. So for the city to meet their expectation, we have to have 2 fire engines. And so we did have ISO come back through in August. We should have a report completed at the end of this month. We reached out to them last week, and they said it should be ready at the end of this month. So we'll see if we've increased that or any. So we're hopeful there. The last thing that I wanted to point out when it comes to staffing is we also looked at concurrent calls for service, and that's how often do we have 2 or more calls happen at the same time in the city. And so over the last 12 months, we went back, there was 498 incidents of having concurrent calls where we had more than 1 call at the same time. And that's important because we have 2 ambulances on duty and we have 1 paramedic engine. And so we probably 40% of our calls are Charlie level calls, which are higher level. They're not the highest, but they're advanced life support. They require an engine and an ambulance. And so if we have 2 Charlie level calls at the same time, one gets the full response of an engine and an ambulance, and one gets an ambulance. Most of the time, those calls go to the hospital. Over 40% of the time, they go to the hospital in the valley because Boulder City Hospital can't offer the services they need. So there are a lot of times throughout the year that both ambulances are in Henderson at the hospital at the same time. And it's typically Sienna or Henderson Hospital are the 2. So that leaves us with none here. We do have a fire engine that can still respond, but they can't transport. And so then we have to wait for community ambulance. And I believe they're about 18 or 20 minutes to respond. We've looked into to see if we could get them to come out here. Prior to my arrival, the last chief looked into to see if we could get them to come out and stage or to cover. And they said no. They said they would always come out if we call them, but that's because they're getting a paycheck when they come out. But from a business model, they can't afford to come sit here and lose another call. So they have enough activity in Henderson and Las Vegas to stay busy all the time. The last thing, just to be clear, so what we're talking about is the additional station and then adding an engine company, which would help us meet that ISO requirement. It would be a captain, an engineer, and a firefighter. The plan would also be to put a reserve ambulance in the station, unstaffed, and that if it's a fire call or an auto accident, they would take the fire engine, and if it's a medical call, they would get out of the fire engine and take the ambulance. And so we would essentially get 2 resources over there with 1 crew, so they can just go back and forth. And so I think that would be a big benefit. The other nice thing is, those times when we have both ambulances out of town, that would give us a 3rd ambulance in town. I looked through that. I don't see very many instances where we've had 3 calls. You know, I mean, there's always going to be those outliers where you have a 3rd call or 4th call, and we couldn't plan for those. But the 3rd would be really helpful because we'd be able to keep a call. The other benefit would be is when we have large incidents like the fires on the interstate or the box truck wreck, everybody at Station 121 goes to those calls, and we still need way more help. We'd be able to always leave a unit when we leave town for those kind of things, or not leave town, but leave the populated area. We'd always be able to leave a unit in service in the city. So that would add another layer of a benefit. So that is the PowerPoint part. I did in my staff report, we have some ideas for how we could potentially staff the station. We've talked about, we want to put in for the SAFER grant, which is it's a FEMA-funded source. It used to be a 3-year with a decreasing match. When the Biden administration took over, they changed it to a 3-year, 100% match. Our thought process with putting in for it is if we don't put in for it and council during the budget process approves this, we can't go back and get it. If we put in for it and council decides they don't support it, we cannot take the grant. But like I said, if we don't, we have to ask for it in January, and it closes, I think, the end of January, first week of February, and then it's closed. So it kind of, unfortunately, it doesn't fall with our budget cycle very well. You know, it works well with people that work on a regular calendar year. So at that point, I'm happy to answer any questions or discuss the ideas.
Thank you. Questions or comments?
I just had a question regarding the different locations for the fire stations. You mentioned how many homes it would be inclusive of. Is there any information on how many homes would not be included in that area, so we know how many would still be affected by which station?
Yeah, I think we figured we had 3,095 homes that were outside of it, and 7,831 people. That's our outside of it. So with the one on the lakeside, 4,474 residents would be now inside that response time, and 1,978 homes. And then on the Adams address, it was 3,521 residents and 1,470 homes. And I will add, if you add those two numbers together, they're more than the 7,000, but that's because there's a little bit of overlap in Del Prado. No matter which station you use, both of them kind of get the bottom of Del Prado. So that one gets overlapped.
Does one of them cover more homes?
The lakeside.
The lakeside one covers. Okay.
Yeah, and again, based on, it's tough because the way the census breaks down data, it doesn't break it down as well as we need it. And so we believe from our crew's knowledge and working that we have a larger senior population up in the trailer parks, the age-restricted communities, than we do on the other side of town. And so that was kind of one of our points really that kind of made us lean towards, if we were to give a suggestion, it would be to staff that one. That would be the one that'd be the higher priority for us.
Thank you.
You referred to age-restricted. You're referring to Lake Mountain then as being age-restricted?
Well, I'm referring to the trailer parks. I believe are they 55 and over communities? The trailer parks that are up on, is it Lake Mountain? I'm hearing yes. I'm still, like I said, I've driven through them up on the hill, but
Okay. Gingerwood is also age-restricted.
Correct. That one is right, that's right down from Station 121, so that one we're comfortable that we have inside of our current area.
Yeah.
So.
Other questions or comments?
Yes, ma'am.
Is this the first time we've done a risk assessment?
To my knowledge, and so that prior to about 30 years ago, it really wasn't the thing to look at. That wasn't the way the fire service did business. In fact, there was a saying in the fire service, 100 years of tradition unimpeded by progress, because firefighters are traditional. They like tradition. And so when you'd ask them, why do you have one station? Because we always have one station. Well, do you need two? I don't know. It was never asked. Prior to really the accreditation model and a lot of the stuff that we were really working on for the last 30 years, nobody looked at response times. The only time a response time got pulled is someone said, like we heard in the accident that happened in town with the Oakland Raider, that the fire department took 20 minutes to show up and they didn't put the fire out. Well, nobody used to track response times unless you got a report like that, and then they would go pull it and say, no, we got there in 3 minutes. Which, fortunately for those communities, they track their response times already. So we didn't do a lot of the stuff that we do nowadays, and so risk wasn't considered. In fact, there's still a lot of fire departments that don't consider risk. You know, they react. If something bad happens, and they go, oh, we probably should do something about that. You know, the way the industry best practice is to really look at your unique risks, and every city's very unique. I mean, Boulder City's unique in the fact that we're 208 square miles, but we all live on like 16 of those miles. You know, but we still have stuff going on in those. You know, we have mountains, we get warm days, to say the least. You know, and so we have unique risks that you're not going to see in other communities. And so, yeah.
I'm just curious. The size of the fire department today.
Yeah.
What was that? Is there a formula that was originally based on that? I mean, we've had a fire department here for quite a long time, and it's grown somewhat. And is it based on, I know this is a first risk assessment,
Yeah.
but is it based on population? How would it typically, a city come up with a ratio or a percentage of, gee, if we have 16,000 people, we probably need X trucks and X firefighters.
Yeah, it doesn't work like that because you can go to cities. So, for example, in downtown Denver metro area, there's a city of Federal Heights, and it's like 2 square miles. And they've decided to stay a city, and they want to have their own fire truck. So they have a fire station in the middle of this little 2 square mile, and they've got a ton of people because it's really populated. So it's really about they can still get there. Plus, they're surrounded by other fire departments who can get there, and when they can't get their own calls, they all help each other so they can get there fast. So it's really based off of your community demographics, off of the risks within that community. I've got some examples because I think it's important to look at. And so I found a few examples of risk-assessed fire departments that are smaller cities than Boulder City or smaller communities. So Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma City is 7.5 square miles. They have 4 fire stations. Because Tinker Air Force Base, that's where they fly in the bombers and they rebuild them. So they have high risk. So due to that risk and some of the activities they do, they've got a 2 million square foot building on their property. So because of that, they had 4 stations. Chief Chesser was the chief in Cheyenne, Wyoming at F.E. Warren Air Force Base. They're 11 square miles. They have 2 fire stations, 65 firefighters, and 14 helicopters. Because their risk was spread out remote. They had remote areas that they would have to fly to do risk, Oh, by the way, the Tinker Air Force Base has 86 full-time firefighters out of 4 stations. Alcoa, Tennessee is 15.9 square miles, 8,499 people, 3 fire stations, and 37 full-time firefighters. Because of Alcoa, there's a specific risk in there that drives that issue. So for 8,400 people, they have 3 fire stations. Beechwood, Ohio is 5.2 square miles with 11,590 people, 2 fire stations, and 47 full-time firefighters. Leavenworth, Kansas, 8.8 square miles, 12,900 population, 2 fire stations, and 48 full-time firefighters. Maitland, Florida, 6.4 square miles, 17,500 people, 2 fire stations, and 46. Los Alamos, New Mexico, which I thought was interesting, the county, 109 square miles, a population of 17,998 people, 6 fire stations, and 150 full-time firefighters. So again, it's really difficult to say 16,000 people should have 2 firefighters or 10 firefighters. It really is based on the risk. And so there's not a magic formula. Unfortunately, again, it's the best practice is to look at what specific risks you have and to talk about how best you can mitigate your risks. And again, and we do that. It's not just with our people. And just to be clear, so we have a good reserve program. We talked about during the briefings. At one point, we got it. When I got here, we had 2. We had some in the academy. We got it to 17. We were making some really good headway. And then the pandemic kind of died down a little bit, and the Valley started hiring. And fortunately for them, they got full-time jobs in the Valley. But unfortunately for us, we lost half our reserves in like 3 months. And so we've looked at that avenue. We've also looked at a partnership with the Parks Department. We've reached out to the National Park Service and said, hey, you have rangers. In their job description, it says they're firefighters. Can we work out an agreement where you can help us? Well, none of them are currently firefighters. And so we said, how about we train your rangers to be firefighters, and in payback, if we have a fire, you come help us. And they said, that'd be great. And they put 1 in our academy. So right now we're training 1. We're hoping to eventually get more of them rotated through. But even that, they might have 2 or 3 in town. They could send 1 or 2 and help us. So that's helping. That's still not a fix. We've reached an agreement with the state of Nevada Division of Forestry to do wildland. We have brush fires or events that require specialized trucks like brush trucks, to where for $3,100 a year, they'll provide all that for us. They'll come out and do our 4th of July standby. They'll come by and do our firefighter wildland training that we're required to have to be in a mutual aid agreement with the park. So they offer all that to us for free, well, for $3,100. But it's far less than it would cost us to pay to do it on our own. So we've looked at the different creative ways to try to reduce that. We've added a community risk reduction program where we're going to start targeting certain risks and see if we can change them through some behavior and some education and some, other adding smoke alarms and things like that. At the end of the day, I feel like we've done as much as we can do with the existing resources we have. I think we're just at a point where there's no way we can get over the hill faster. It's just, we don't want our firefighters driving 100 miles through town. We want them to drive safely, because if they get in a wreck on the way to the call, it doesn't do anybody any good. And the fire trucks, when they get in a wreck, they don't typically fare well for the other person. So we're trying to find the safest way to fix the problem. And really, like Taylor said, our responsibility is to identify the risk and to bring it to council, who's ultimately responsible for the decision on how we mitigate that risk. And we can offer solutions and we can work with you on that. But at the end of the day, it's the direction of council that gives us. Yes.
Yes, I have one more question. You said that insurance services offers findings and that our risk, our insurance level went from a 2 to a 4.
Yes, ma'am. So a 1 is the best and a 10 is the worst. Typically, when you see municipal fire departments, they're in the 5 to 1 range. And so everybody wants to be a 1. I think in the country there's maybe a few hundred, 300 or 400 ISO 1s. That's a pretty prestigious rating to have. ISO 2 is a good rating. If we could get back to ISO 2, that'd be great. We're hoping to get to at least a 3 based on our last assessment when we visited with them. They felt confident we should get to at least a 3 and maybe even creep into a 2. There's 10 points between each rating. And so when they look at an ISO, they look at fire stations, they look at engines, they look at the personnel, they look at your training, they look at your training center, and they look at your dispatch and your water. So they look at a bunch of things. The only thing that we don't have control over, and the fire department really, is the dispatch and the water. And so we work with the police department on the dispatch center, and we try to meet those standards and reduce, get as many points as we can there. The water, we have a great water system. Unfortunately, the way that model works is if your water system is way better than everything else, they actually take points off your water. It's kind of a divergent that they add to make it more fair, which I don't understand that, but so we lose points because we have great water.
Okay, would it affect our individual insurance premiums for fire if we're at 4 versus if we're at 2?
So I've heard explanations on both. So for commercial, yes, for sure. Commercial insurance is and again, it depends on the provider. State Farm, for one, is one example. They don't use ISO. I don't know why. They have their own internal rating. But for the ones that do use ISO, which is the majority of them, for commercial, there's a percentage, and I can get that data for you. There's a percentage for each reduction. Commercial, there's a debate, is if you get your max benefit once you get to 5 or if it continues to go to 1. I've heard that it continues to go, but again, I wouldn't swear to that until I see the data. And I try to do all this based on the real numbers that we can see. So there definitely should be a reduction in insurance for our commercial providers, providing their insurance is aware of what the rating is. I will tell you that I was visiting with one of our members at Rotary, who's an insurance salesman, and he wasn't familiar with our insurance rating. He had thought it was something that it wasn't. So, yes.
Do you know why we went from a 2 to a 4? Was there something specific, or?
Our understanding was their training records weren't in very good shape. There was some other things. Obviously, they said we should have 2 engines in service. We have 3 engines in the city. One is a truck, but it has an engine on it. But we only staff 1, and they only count staffed equipment when they do their main numbers. They do count reserve equipment, and that counts for something, but it doesn't count as the staffed equipment. So we don't have that. Wasn't staffed. I don't know the rest of it. I know that when we got here, we knew that it was coming up, because we got a phone call saying we're going to be here tomorrow, and we said, no, you're not. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and that wouldn't work. And so we were able to negotiate with them to give us a couple months. And then Greg worked really hard to go through and look at what we had and look at their point system, and we tried to bridge anywhere we could. As far as having like a community risk reduction plan that wasn't in place before, we have a full plan in place now. So we went through and hunted for any points we could have. We totally revamped our training program. Our records are great. I mean, we have a response policy. Again, the standard of cover is going to be a better version of that, but we already had the critical task analysis and that kind of stuff done, which is important, and that gives you extra points. So we went and got all those points we could get to help us get back closer to where we should be. We were told by the inspector as he left, if we were to get a second station, he believed we would get to an ISO 1. Again, that's somebody saying something in passing, but that would be awesome to be able to achieve that, but
I got one. So, if say 2 of the ambulance they have to transport to Henderson or St. Rose, how long are they normally gone for?
it can range. Henderson Hospital, I think a round trip's about an hour and a half. Yes, and then Sienna could be closer to 2, and it really depends on the status of the hospital, the kind of patient they have. Obviously, they have a critical patient and they're working a core or something, they'll be there longer because they'll probably continue to work them into the hospital somewhat. And then Sienna, again, a little bit longer. But I think we're looking at really about an hour and a half to Henderson and maybe closer to 2 hours to Sienna.
And then how long would it take for a community ambulance to come into town?
They'll come in once you dial 911 and say you need them, and they're about 18 or 20 minutes. It depends on where they're staged at. So ambulances are unique, and they don't typically stage in a firehouse. They move ambulances around based on a predictive model. A lot of times, they'll, based on where calls tend to fall. So they might be at Target first part of the day, and then they'll move over to a restaurant later, and they kind of move them based on where they think they're going to need them for that time of day. So depending on where they're at when we call them, it affects that gap a little bit. So, and then to be clear, so when we have a wreck and we need a rescue on site of a wreck, we call Henderson, because they're going to bring out firefighters and extrication equipment and people to help with the wreck. When we just have a patient, we call community ambulance. When it's just a medical call, so we don't call Henderson for just straight medical calls.
Okay. And then if there's an accident down at the lake, is it you guys that respond to it?
Correct. Okay. Yeah, so Lake Mead doesn't have any trained firefighters, and they don't have any trained ambulances out there this year. The ambulances, apparently that's a Washington budget decision, I don't know. But due to our mutual aid agreement with them, we do send a resource. But what we've done, because during the summer it was getting to be a lot, and so what we've said is if it's a medical call, we'll send a unit, and if it's a fire call, we'll send a different unit, but we're not sending all the units, so we can't do that. And that was a practice in the past where they would send multiple units, and we're not. Our first priority is still here. Same thing if it's not a priority call. If somebody's got a rolled ankle and they're not feeling well, we won't go. We'll have community come. Because community will come in, but Lake Mead's concern was community takes about 20 minutes or so to get to the gate, and then they don't know the park as well as our firefighters do, and so there's another delay. And so sometimes it could be 25 or 30 minutes to get to them. So on a life-threatening emergency, to me, Lake Mead's an important partner to us, both because of the relationship we have, but also because of the proximity to the city and what it does for the city. It's a huge benefit. Yeah. So to not go out and help seems wrong. So we'll definitely go help. We're just not sending everybody out there.
Okay.
Same thing with a fire. We're going to send 3 out there. We're going to do what we can. We're going to keep the neighbors' buildings from burning down. But where they don't get all the firefighters, they can call Henderson. They can call Clark County, call for more help. And that's what they would do is in a big incident. They would call from everybody to come help. And everybody to send a little bit.
All right. Thank you.
Councilmember Adams?
Thank you, Mayor. So with this community risk assessment, does it take into account the fact that we used to and are moving back towards that? We have a number of events that are happening in town, and obviously that usually requires the presence of an ambulance or some type of emergency response that's ready for there. Does it take into account the fact that we might have to have that ready for that, and then we also are still having to be sure we're staffed and ready for the rest of the community?
Yeah, NRS is interesting because they mandate for large events what has to be on site. So for instance, for Spring Jamboree or the Worst Fest, it's an event under 20,000. One ambulance has to be on site with at least 2 intermediates or paramedics. Mm-hmm. For larger events like Art in the Park, because they exceed a certain threshold, they're required to have 2 ambulances and a first aid tent. And so what we've tried to do, we're willing to provide that. That's an overtime unit. It's not part of our regular duty units, and they have to cover the cost of that. But that tends to be high enough that it's beneficial to hire third party like Community or Guardian Elite. And so that's what they tend to do is those are extra units that they bring in and they manage the event. Now the way it's written in I believe our city code is if they do have an event, they start to treat the patient and they bring them to us and our medics take them to town. So it's still Boulder City firefighters take people to town once it happens. Unless we're all busy and we can't, if we're on a fire or then they would just take them to town. If we're here, we take them, which would be my preference because I have nothing against the third-party ambulances, but I'll put my guys up against any of those every day. The level of service that they offer to our community is far, far superior than they're going to get anywhere else. So that'd be if I was sick or my wife was sick, I'd want them taking them.
And you said you identified a number of homes that, prior to this, you would not have been able to address fire needs or service needs there. And then saying that now you can. So is there now a system in place so that before you're even leaving the station, you're aware that the location where you're going is one of those, so that right off the bat you're going there with the necessary?
We have all 45 of them documented in our risk assessment, and then we have a unique response package. So instead of typically we're going to take the front engine, we're going to take the reserve ladder truck and 1 ambulance, if we have those calls, we'll also bring the hose tender, which is a used Dodge truck. That's all it is. We're going to put in 500 feet. Now, we've just got the truck. We haven't actually got the hose put on it yet, but we have the hose, we have the truck, we have all the equipment. It'll have 500 feet of hose put in it, and they'll just drive that to the bottom of the hill, and then the fire truck will park at the fire hydrant like it normally would, and they'll drive that truck to the top of the hill and lay that hose all the way down the hill. And the one I use is up on Lido. So we actually met with the homeowner, and they allowed us to go there and train for several days, which was really helpful. And our plan is really to, as we go through the coming years, is to pick a different one of these hills or locations, visit with a homeowner, and train so that we're really comfortable with that. We first did it when we first came up. We actually did it by hand. That's not a common thing. Most places that have remote houses have brush trucks, little pickup trucks with water tanks on them, and they just run up and they spray a little water. So those big fire trucks won't go up those hills. We actually tried, and it just sits right at the bottom and just rolls. So we tried different things until it worked. Once we found a plan that worked and we could deploy fast, then we trained the whole department on it, and we wrote a policy on it, and that's the way we do it going forward.
And then I do have some other questions, but I don't want to get ahead of here. Are we going to be approaching each of these item by item, or are we talking about them as a whole right now? Okay.
Well, I think, as Chief Gray said at the outset, that because these have a lot of similarities, and he had a PowerPoint that flowed end to end, the topics are combined.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure. So, regarding, actual construction of a new facility, that it's obviously, I think that seems the most doable, if you will, as far as resources and what we can do. I did speak with Dr. Ligan, the Chief Health Officer of Southern Nevada Health District, on Monday. I guess that's, and discussed the possibility that it's something that we are considering. One of those options, I think it was option 6 on there, about potentially having the ability to use ARPA funds to also include a public health type resource in that area. Certainly he's interested if we were to go in that route. So I think anytime we have the opportunity, especially if ARPA funds is potential, we might not have that availability of resources again. So I think we should look at that. But that being said, we can build a building and then we can maintain it, but then it has to be manned. And so you have, it looks like we've got a program here that we can potentially, for the first 3 years, we can pay for that. What do we, but this seems like the kind of expansion that we would want to make sure is permanent.
Sure,
this
absolutely.
is because we've identified the need. And so if we are going to move in this direction, we want to do it right. And we want to make sure that it's staffed appropriately. Yeah. So, how do we make sure, because that seems to be the real cost here in the end, is
the long-term cost for sure.
Yes, is having that staffing. So, have we looked or discussed this with finance, or what are we looking at?
So we've had just preliminary conversations and talked with like Boulder Flat Solar. Some of the solar projects are coming on. So what we didn't want to do is come forward with a big ask. Obviously, it's still a need, and say, well, yeah, we're gonna have to get rid of 3 cops and 2 of these to make it happen. That wasn't our goal at all. And so we did talk and said, hey, what projects do we have coming online over the next 12 to 18 months, and what kind of revenue are they going to add to the general fund? And there are 3 projects in visiting with Brock Armentrout that should bring about $2 or $2.5 million new funds into the general fund. And that was kind of the thought process, is this seems like the right time to do it, is when those are coming on, and so that we're not looking for cuts, we're not asking for more taxpayer money, we're just trying to add and fix a need at a time when there's resources available. And to kind of build off the public health thing. One of the things that when that first got announced with ARPA, I thought, well, that's silly. We're going to build a building for a pandemic. By the time it's built, the pandemic's going to be over. Well, we're hearing now that COVID may always be here at some degree, and we may have seasonal fluctuations up and down. And one of the things that I think is important about that, we did a lot of testing and stuff in the street, in parking lots. And some days it's great right now. It's a perfect time of the year. But in the summer, it's horrible. In the winter, it's cold. And we had people out in the rain, and we're trying to cover them with little pop-ups. And this would be a nice facility that we could actually, when we have testing days and vaccination days, or like we talked about the partnership with SNHD, we could actually build it in such a way that we could have a flow through where they can come in one way and go out the other way. We can do vaccinations, and we don't have to disrupt the Smith Center. I mean, there's a lot of uses for it. I think it would be a potentially really good combination.
Well, I think a lot of people have kind of forgotten, and I understand why, but there are a lot of health needs, public health needs beyond just the pandemic that we've had to deal with, and a lot of it has been kind of maybe not forgotten, but just kind of put on the back burner as we address the immediate thing in front of us. But Boulder City residents, also have a lot of health needs as well. So
absolutely.
Any potential for us to partner and make more available services with SNHD, and I know I'm working right now trying to get a mobile service from the health district that can go to the library for when needs are identified. So that's one possible thing. But if we have the opportunity, and this is something we are looking towards expanding and creating another station, and there's the opportunity to have a public health aspect to this, I think to me it's a no-brainer that we should do that while we have the opportunity, if that opportunity is truly there. So,
Anyone else? Councilmember Bridges?
Yeah, thank you. I too I was thinking about that project with the health district, because I was reading about, for example, blood drives and the need for universal donor blood, and we talked about the basic training for the community in CPR and ways in which we can help maybe a family member before the ambulance shows up, and those kinds of things seems like it would be a good place to have those kinds of options.
Absolutely, yeah. Our part of our community risk reduction is to increase our community CPR and our Stop the Bleed classes, because, if somebody does have a heart attack in a remote area and their loved one can start doing CPR, that increases their chances. It buys them a few more minutes while we're racing over there. And so if we can reduce that risk a little bit, that's the way to do it. And having that room, and there's no reason it would have to be just for vaccinations or just, it can be built so that it can be modular, so you can change it to whatever you need it to do, a different closet for a different thing. If we're doing classes, it's one closet. If we're doing, vaccinations, it's another one. If we're doing SNHD, can have an area where they can switch it up and make it fit a lot of things, so we're not wasting space. It could be used for, we talked about, earlier in the CIP workshop about a classroom. This could be the classroom as well. It could be, obviously there would be a hierarchy of needs. If we have a public health need, that would be what it is. But if it's sitting there empty and we can put a class on, yeah, well, absolutely. Why wouldn't we use it for that? So, I think it's a great idea.
Great, thank you.
Councilmember Jorgensen?
I just saw down here the possibility of partnering with the National Park Services for something like that. Is the location that you were looking at a place where they would partner?
No, when we originally started the process, we met right away with the chief and the deputy chief at the national park. And the original indication was they're going to build a new fire station at Boulder Beach. We could build it probably wherever. And so that got us pretty excited. We're like, great, we potentially have funding for that. And so I had a follow-up meeting with the acting superintendent. And as we looked into it more, the building is going to be built with SNPLMA funds, which is through the Bureau of Land Management. It's basically whenever they sell BLM land. In the rest of the country, when they sell BLM land, it goes to the federal government coffers. Apparently in Nevada, when they sell it, it goes to this fund, and it's given out through grants. But whatever's built has to be built on federal land. And so we would have to build it on park property. And when we started looking, if we put a station in park property, that 4-minute travel time is pulled so far away from what we need, it would help a few homes over there, but we would lose 90% of the benefit by putting it outside of that area. And so we definitely followed that. In fact, we said we were excited for a few months, because that's about how long it took to run this down, and then it's just probably not an option.
So when and if they build that station, will you no longer do the calls down to the lake then?
I would like to believe that, but they have a fire station out there now that's just old. I think they're replacing it. I think across the street where the trailers are out there by Boulder RV Park, I think they already have a station, so I think they're just replacing it. It comes down to what the Park Service allocates for firefighting and EMS needs each year based on their own internal models, so I don't know. I'm certain they're not going to have enough firefighters to put a fire out. They may have enough EMS next year to take care of their own EMS, but they'll always be asking for help for firefighting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Councilmember Fox?
Yeah, to qualify for the ARPA money, the public health building, what kind of guidelines are we looking at, or does it have to be a certain size?
Do we have I think we're still researching the ARPA. The ARPA is interesting because it seemed like public health, COVID are in there, and then there's some infrastructure, some utility kind of things. But it seems like there's still a lot of research we've been trying to do. It feels like it fits in there, that side of the building. We couldn't build the whole station with ARPA money, I don't believe, but we believe, and maybe Mr. Taylor can.
Yeah, it wouldn't necessarily have to be a specific size, and the finance department is in contact with the federal government to get some additional guidance on what that can actually be used for, but it is one of the general overarching qualifying items, along with the wastewater, water, and broadband that we would be able to use the money for. So,
I think it's critical that we get that pinned down because that's now the third version of what we can use the money for that I've heard. I don't know how we can justify a public health facility as being COVID related, even though the pandemic is certainly still a factor. So we need an answer as far as what the American Rescue Plan money can be used for, because initially there was a great deal of talk that we were going to have quite a bit of latitude with that money. And then it was stated, no, since we didn't really sustain any loss of revenue, none of the money could be used for that. And so that left only things like water and wastewater projects as something that, and broadband, network connectivity, as the only possible use of those funds.
yeah, public health and COVID-related expenses such as testing, something like that, has always been one of the criteria.
Well, is it public health or is it COVID related?
I believe it's public health.
Okay,
But we'll get you the pinned down answer.
thank you. Any other questions? I do want to go to this issue of public health facilities. Certainly the fire service has expanded its range of operations over decades now. I think within your assessment, there was a figure quoted in there that 80% of the calls you run now are for EMS services rather than fire services. Is that
It's probably
correct?
pretty close, 78 or 80. It's up there.
Okay. We do have a hospital here in Boulder City. My understanding is that they are trying to find as many ways as possible for people to utilize their services. So, when we start talking about having our fire department shift into providing public health services, we do have a hospital here. And I think that would be the first place that we'd want to have a conversation with regarding those types of services, since, it is a medical facility. And, talking about broadening out the fire services even beyond emergency response, that somehow this is going to be something else, a clinic or something, we already have that. It already exists. So I think that's an important aspect of what we're talking about. We have a hospital. We're fortunate to have a hospital here. Do you believe they would provide those services, or that's inappropriate to use a hospital for that?
No, I don't disagree. I would say that during the pandemic, we were forced as the fire department into public health. I mean, it's not our desire to be vaccinators and testers, and our community had a need, and as firefighters, we fix problems. That's what we do, and so that's why we did that. Our goal with that building isn't that we would run the public health. It would be that if we're putting in a fire station and we can use some ARPA money to add on a thing that in the future, when we're doing these kind of testing and these kind of outreach events, and we did partner with the hospital on a lot of it, we could do it there. When we partnered with the hospital, we did it in the street because they couldn't take the patients, the testing in those large numbers to the hospital because they have other patients they can't expose. And so we had to have site away from there. So the goal is to have somewhere where it's weather protected. In the summer it's cool, in the winter it's warm. That's all it is. I 100% don't want to be in the public health long term. But if it's going to be here and we're going to be the ones that are expected to continue to do it, I would want to have a facility that we could do it safer, and like I said, we had people that were getting hot and people were getting wet and cold, and I would prefer not to
I
have
do
it.
understand, Chief, and I think the fire department did an outstanding job in the response to this. I don't know that we can plan on having pandemic conditions for the rest of our lives.
Oh, I hope not.
I think we all hope not.
Yeah, I'm hoping for a Christmas miracle myself, that it just all goes away, but
But again, I think that the more appropriate thing to talk about when we talk about public health is to understand that we are fortunate. We have a hospital here that apparently feels that it's underutilized and is looking for ways to reach out. Is that the better place to direct this to? I do understand all the efforts that the fire department put forth. Certainly we have buildings that sit empty most of the time here in Boulder City. But we do have a medical facility here in Boulder City, not only the hospital, but now there's a quick care facility on the hospital grounds as well. Again, I'm pointing out that we have resources. Maybe we need to better utilize those resources with regard to that type of thing. A couple other questions. You talked about potential hazmat issues, hazardous materials. When we talk about, I think it was one of the solar facilities you were talking about had some toxic oil, 46 million gallons or something like that.
4.3 million pounds.
Pounds?
Yeah, it's measured in pounds.
Okay. What are they responsible for as far as containment and that sort of thing?
I think financially they're always responsible for the containment, but when there's an accident, I mean, we are the emergency service provider for them since they're in the city, so we would be responsible to show up and keep it from spreading. They're still responsible to do the cleanup. We're just responsible to stop the problem. Now, some facilities like Rocky Research, they have a lot of smaller amounts of chemicals, but they have a response team and they have chemists in there, and so if they call us, it's because it's gotten really bad because they have some of that. A lot of like the plant, San Diego Power and Electric, they have a safety officer. So some minor spills and stuff they're going to take care of. We're talking about a rupture, an emergency. They have, one of them has 32,000 pounds of sulfuric acid. And so if they have a rupture in that acid, obviously they're not going to be able to handle that. So they're going to call for emergency services. And so those are the kind of things that we would come in and help. The other place is if they're transporting the chemicals in and out of the facilities. So when they're recycling or replenishing, they're bringing stuff in on highway accidents. That's where we see oftentimes delivery trucks that have an accident, and then we're dealing with them there.
Okay. And how many personnel do you think would be necessary then for that type of response?
So on a hazmat entry team, again, hazmat is never the same. No two hazmats are the same because, again, it depends.
Well, let's use the one with the toxic oil. That seems to be the one that has the largest quantity of potential.
Yeah, so it would depend on what actually spilled because they're not.
Let's say all of it spilled.
Well, it's not all
worst case scenario.
Okay, it's not all in one container. So they're typically in 55-gallon drums. So it'd be reasonable to assume that one would spill, or if they dropped the truck and dropped a couple. Again, we would respond with 8. Our goal is to get 8 trained hazmat technicians on each shift. And so that allows us to have 2 people in suits to go in. You always have to have a backup team, and then you have a rescue team. So we'd have 6, and then you have one that's the safety officer, and then one that's the technical research. So that would be our plan, is to start with 8. If we could get in there and we could stop the leak, we could plug the hole, we could put a band on it, whatever we need to do hazmat-wise, put an overpack drum on it to stop the problem, that would be our goal, and then they would pay a contractor to come clean it up. If it exceeds our capacity, and it's honestly, if we have a big hazmat, as soon as we respond, we're going to call Henderson's hazmat team to join us. Hazmats very commonly are regional responses just because not many fire departments can have enough hazmat to handle any hazmat in their community. So you pick something that you can do a reasonable initial response, and then your second and third and fourth alarms bring in other stuff. So for example, Henderson has a level 2 hazmat team. Even Henderson can't handle all hazmats. If it's a weapons of mass destruction, radioactive kind of, that's a level 1 team. They have to have Las Vegas come in and help them. Because again, they don't have enough WMD in their town to justify having that extra training, and they have a partner right next door. So, but they have enough response to come in and handle most incidents until they get to a certain level. And that's where our goal is to deal with our level of incidents.
And that's what I'm trying to understand is what is the level of preparedness that we need.
Like I said, I believe having those 8 technicians on each shift, that would allow us to start any hazmat technician level event. And then as it grows, our partners will come in and help us with the growth.
So you're talking about training 24 people or adding 24
No,
people?
training. So we've already trained 8 of them. The school is in Colorado. It's a national school. It's FEMA funded. It's free for transportation, education, and all their per diem. The only cost to the city is we have to cover them when they're gone. So we have managed to get 8 through. Our goal is next fiscal year, once we start the next budget year and we have the funds available, to start sending them again to the classes until we figured it'd take 2 or 3 years to get them all through that class to reach that level where we'll have 8 per shift. So no, not to hire, what did you said 24 more. No, we're not looking to hire 24 more.
Okay.
I wouldn't say no if you wanted me to. I'm just saying that.
That's what I'm afraid of, Chief. When you did this GIS model of response times, was it based strictly on as the crow flies from one point to the other?
No, it's based off of, they have all of the streets built into them. They take a certain percentage of time for a right turn and a left turn. It's all calculated into the model. And so it's a standard GIS model. They run it. It's based off of the conditions of the types of streets we have, the hills, the angles. They have all that figured into it. So it's based off our community, not off the crow. That's why if you look at the maps, you'll notice there are some places like in Muni Golf where, as the crow flies, it looks like it's a mile from the station, but the only way to get there is to go down Adams and then Darlene and around, or Georgia, and then you got to work your way around. And so that's why you'll see some areas that have green and then an area in the middle that's not covered, and it's because it is the way the roads and the turns. There's no other way to get there.
Okay. And when looking at the way that was modeled, the potential location of 701 Adams, it looks like the model was only done for an area primarily to the west of that, and not so much, to the east, and not so much to the west. Whereas the Hemingway model takes in that entire area.
If I can look at the map real quick. I believe that was all 4-minute travel time. That is, the only thing we didn't have them do is when it gets outside of the populated area, we didn't continue to run the lines out to the dump and out. But I believe that is 4 minutes in all directions from that station.
Because it seems we have a much denser population, number of homes per acre in this part of town versus the Hemingway area.
At least when we did the analysis through the demographics, what we did is we took the number of homes, the location of homes, and we calculated it by 2.35 people, I believe is what we did, which is kind of the national average per home. We don't have the demographic data for every home in Boulder City. That just doesn't exist anywhere. We'd have to actually poll them. And so that's what we use for our numbers. And we actually had higher percentages on that side than this side. I think the property, it seems like the property over on the Adams side, there's more acreage, there's larger lots, there's a little bit more spread out. That's part of the issue, where up there in the trailer parks, in 20 acres, there's 400 trailers. We're out there in 20 acres, there might be 20 homes. And so that's where some of that numbers differences happen from, I think.
Okay, but the Adams location would include, for instance, the original town site, from here down to, say, New Mexico Street.
I believe so. I don't know how far it goes north without looking at it directly. But yeah, it does. It has all of Del Prado. It has the old town. It's got Bee Hill or San Felipe area. It's got all that. And in looking at these, if you look at all three of them, there's always a little spot somewhere. Like for instance, the airport. There's that little spot that just outside of it. That's always going to exist, where there's a little area that doesn't fit inside of a community. And as I travel the country and evaluate fire departments, most fire departments, that's just an understood thing. There's just, you can't get everything covered unless you have fire stations on every corner. It's just not realistic. So there is a part of that where you do the most you can with the placement you can. There's just not a perfect scenario. So usually what will happen is if you start to see some outside of it in a community that has a lot of growth, they'll say when that hits a certain spot, when a certain amount is outside, then we're going to consider another station. And when a certain amount gets over here, then we'll consider another one. But it has to have a certain percentage to drive that decision to spend the money, because to put a fire station where you can protect 6 homes, that's kind of hard to justify the expense for what you get back out of it.
Well, and I mean, that's always the equation, right? Is, you know, what is the capability that we have as a community to support this, and what level of risk is the public willing to either pay to reduce or accept as risk?
Correct.
You know, you talk about, I believe the figure was 45 homes that are difficult to reach. Well, that's 45 homes, and those are people who have made a decision on where they would like to place their home, and then ask everybody else to get special equipment and do all that type of thing to protect the decision they've made. So there are those type of offsets that we have to look at as well. You know, what does everyone else owe for someone making a decision of their own? Certainly when people look to buy a home, you know, many of them look to see how far they are from schools, how far they are from different services. And, you know, quite honestly, I'm one of those people who wanted to know where the closest fire station, hospital, quick care, all of that was to any place I was looking at. So everybody has to look at what's important to them and realize that the further away I get from that service, the more risk that I'm assuming of where I'm choosing to live. Holly, would you be able to go to page 57 of the packet?
Don't believe I have the packet loaded.
While she's seeing if she can get that done, you know, one of the risks that you noted in your risk assessment report was the inclusion of the Pirates Cove.
Pirates Cove?
Yeah, it's a 20,000 square foot home that's rented out.
Oh, okay. I mean, in the actual risk assessment?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
You know how that risk might be mitigated?
I guess I don't understand your question. I mean, I believe there's 4 homes that are connected into one. Am I correct?
Well, there, you know, again, I've not seen it for myself. I haven't been there for myself, but I've been sent a video clip of it. It appears to be an unlicensed rental enterprise within a neighborhood here in Boulder City. So when we talk about, you know, that being far away and the potential for requiring additional emergency services, perhaps the answer to that one is to bring it into compliance with the code.
I don't have any arguments with you. We did go up there and look at the house. We looked at how we could approach it. We looked at different ways. I believe we can get a fire truck to that one. But we did look at it because it is a complicated, the way it's set up there, it would be a really hard fire to fight.
Yeah.
But we did look at it. But yeah, it's obviously, I'm not going to argue with you to make sure everybody follows the code. I agree with you.
Well, again, I was actually surprised to see that was part of your assessment, because the reason that might be of greater risk is the fact that they're not in accordance with our city code.
Yeah, and to be clear, if that house had 4 families living in it, it would be on that list, because the way it's built, there's one of them, you can't get to the front of the house from the road. You have to come down a hill and come around. And so that presents a risk for us. And we talk about critical task analysis, where you would need 15 firefighters at a regular house. You need a lot more firefighters at that house. So that limits what my crews can do when they first get there, because they can't even go in the front door. They got to figure out how to get hose lines down the hill and around the corner. And so even if those were just standard used homes, it would be on there, because it's a big piece of property. And again, they're close enough that if a fire started, we could see it move from one to another to another. It could be a long couple days. And so, like I said, that one, we consider use some in risk assessment, but a lot of it is like a structural risk assessment. We look at the structure. We look at the building and where it's placed and when it was built, and exposures on how close it is to other houses, how accessible. We look at all that. Can you get a fire truck around 4 sides, or can you just get it to one side? Is there water there? You know, some places we have a fire hydrant, but we found when we got there and opened it up, there's no water in it. I mean, it trickles out, but it's not sufficient because where it was placed. And so we consider all those things, and again, that helps us score, hey, is this building a higher risk or a lower risk building? That way it's just not, well, that looks bad, we're going to make it high. It's got to be scored. And again, so...
Well, and that's the purpose of having fire codes and building codes and all of that, is that when something does get built, where it's built, how it's built, all of those are things that, that's why we have building codes and fire codes and those types of things.
100% agree with you.
Yes, thank you. This was some information that I had put together. There have been a couple of questions already about, what's normal or what's average. One of the things that I had done, if you go to the next slide there, the information that Chief Gray had provided on our number of calls that we get over the past 5 years, we've been somewhere between 2,300 and 2,400 calls for the last 5 years. Does that, again, I know you've said you've had difficulty finding information that's beyond that time period. Is there any indication that they were far lower, say in 2010, or have we been about the same over these past
I believe this
decade?
Yeah, I believe this is correct. This is about what we've seen for the last, the nature of calls tends to change a little bit, but as far as the number, I mean, the population hasn't grown much, so we shouldn't be seeing a big growth in calls because our population is relatively stable. So I would say that this looks to be accurate.
Yeah, these are the numbers that you had sent out to us.
Oh, then they are.
Yeah, I didn't cheat on the numbers. They're your numbers. So.
All right, then they're perfect.
You go to the next screen, please. Again, the number of calls for fire suppression, we seem to have been roughly equal over the past 5 years, anywhere between 40 and 60. Next slide. Average number of calls appears to fluctuate between about, 1,500 to 1,650. Last year, what looks to be the second highest year over the past 5 years.
And I'd say if you looked at slides 60 and 63 together, you'll notice that you see something similar in the other calls for service, but they're the opposite. So some of the years were lower on emergency calls, were higher on other calls, and that really comes down to the old record management systems, the way you coded a call. So now if it's a medical call, it's an NFIRS code 321, that's a standard code. In the old system, you could put a 300 in there, or you could put something more vague in there, and it affected, to be honest, it affected the length of the report, and so you didn't always get good data. So sometimes you got an other call that really should have been classified as a medical call. So the total calls, I think if you looked at 60 and 63 together, would probably see a little bit more consistency in those years. Except the other calls tend to be unclassified medical related calls. On a cyst-up that they canceled them on scene, or something other medical that didn't rise to the level of taking them to the hospital. So I think that would give you a little bit more stability in that line there.
Okay. And again, we tend to see these numbers stay, within a certain range over the years.
Pretty close, yeah.
Yeah, we're not seeing significant increases or decreases.
So far, from the data we saw, like I said, going forward, we're going to have really good data, so we're going to be able to really drill down. Even when we see an increase, we're going to be able to tell you if the increase is advanced life support call or a basic life support call. Is it a cardiac related? Is it a fall? We'll be able to really drill down on what our increases are and why they're happening. So that's part of our goal, is to better understand our community. And as they age, we should see a different kind of calls. And if we suddenly got a bunch of young kids in town, we might see a different, maybe more sports-related injuries, so we'll be able to track that a lot better going forward.
Over the past year, how many times may it have occurred where there was simply no response possible? All firefighters, all equipment were occupied and unable to respond to another call that came in.
So what we do when nobody's here, we do emergency callback, and so that's when we call our off-duty people. We also initiate, if we have a call, we also will initiate a community ambulance. So probably, I'm guessing, just a guess, a half a dozen times nobody was here. We initiated an emergency callback. Community started en route. Occasionally, when community will come en route, we'll get enough firefighters to staff another ambulance off duty, and they'll take it first. Or one of the other ambulances that were in Henderson will be able to clear fast enough to still beat community to town. But again, just a guess. We can pull the data for sure, but I'm guessing a half a dozen times there was nobody.
Over the course of the year.
Yeah, which doesn't sound like much, and not to over.
Well, it is if it's your call.
It is,
doesn't
and
get answered.
if you're having chest pain or a heart attack, I mean, if your heart stops 20 minutes, it's an unfortunate time to have that. I'm just being honest with you. But there are some things that you can happen that if we can get there in 5 or 6 minutes and we can give you the right medicine, we can reverse what's going on. And so, yeah, that 20 minutes is a really long time, because some of those, it can create a long-term damage or an irreversible problem. So,
Yeah.
But again, it's just a rough
It
guess.
can cause death. I mean, let's be honest about it. It can cause death.
Absolutely. I can get you, if you want those numbers, we can dig through data. I have a great data person who can get them.
I think he just pointed at you, Assistant Chief Cheddar.
Yeah, he can definitely get them for you if we need them.
Okay. On page 64, there are some figures that I also got from the NFPA regarding averages for different cities. 1.2 firefighters per 1,000 population. And what's our current count of firefighters?
21 firefighters and then 3 in admin. So Greg and I, we consider firefighters. They don't always consider us firefighters, but we still are. And then our training officer.
I've not heard what they do consider you, but
Well,
I think they call you chief. I've
I
heard
do,
heard
to
them
my
say
face.
that.
No, they're good guys.
Okay. And then 1.3 stations per 1,000. And these, again, the way the NFPA generally breaks things down is they will group communities in a 10 to 25,000 range, and then a 25 to 50, and then 50 to 100, and then 100 and above. So these figures were the ones for the 10 to 25,000 population range, which obviously is where Boulder City falls.
Yeah, I think the second, unless I'm misreading, I think the second one is probably a typo. 1.3 fire stations per 1,000 people. I mean, I think that would put us at like 17 fire stations. So I think that's just
I believe that might be per 10,000.
okay.
Yes.
So that would be more.
Well, you're here asking for more. So
Well, not that much. I want to be realistic. I think 12 is reasonable. No, I'm just kidding.
And of those cities in that range, the number with 2 pumpers, which I believe that's what you've said we have.
We have 1 staffed. We have 2 reserve. One's a ladder and one's an engine, but only 1 staffed.
Okay, but I mean, as far as equipment goes.
Yeah, they would consider this staffed. I think the ISO survey or the NFPA survey would be staffed engines. A lot of people have reserve engines that.
Well, they did. This particular number, I don't believe they made that distinction. They were just talking about equipment. They based it equipment and then personnel. But almost half the departments have 3 to 4 pumpers. So again, it looks like we are below the average for that. And again, looking at the number of stations, almost half have 1 station and about a third have 2 stations. And then pretty much the remainder of those pages, that is the documentation from the NFPA. One of the other things that is brought out in the NFPA are the number of communities or the percentage of communities that are either all volunteer, primarily career, or all career. And I believe the figure was for primarily career, somewhere around 40% of the departments are either primarily career or totally career firefighters. In other words, full-time firefighters is what they're referring to. With our current labor contracts, what is the possibility? You've mentioned the use of reserves, but some time ago, a few months ago, you had mentioned to me that there's something in the contracts that specifies the number of reserves that can serve at any given time.
So the contract, I believe, states that one reserve can replace one of the 7 firefighters, but it doesn't say how many can work beyond that. So if there's extra reserves, they can exceed that. But by contract, it's written that only one of the full-time spots can be filled with a reserve. Now there are exceptions to that, and so if we have mandatory overtime or we can't find somebody else, if we've made other attempts and we can't get that filled, we always fill that seat. And so if the people are on vacation or sick or not available or somebody leaves in the middle of the shift and we need to put a reserve in that second spot, we always fill the shift. We always cover those 7 seats. So but by contract, it's written, the way it was written in the labor agreement, only one of the 7 full-time positions can be filled by a reserve. And my conversation with the union was, when we were talking about this, is if we can get this second station, is I want to have that changed to 2, because I want to be able to have both stations to be able to get a reserve. The struggle with the reserves really has been, our reserves are great. The help is keeping them. It's just because I think right now, Vegas is down 60. North Las Vegas is so short on paramedics. They're talking about having to change how they respond in ambulances. Henderson's down. I think they're getting ready to hire 40 or 50. And so our reserves are working 2 days a month, and we love them, but when somebody across the hill offers them a full-time job and a big paycheck, we don't fault them at all for going. If I was them, I'd go. And so we lose them to that. So it is kind of hard to maintain those reserves. So like I said, right now we have 10, and we're doing our best to hold on to the 10 we have.
And we have no volunteers, is that correct?
No, we don't. And part of that problem is to get your state certifications to be able to be allowed to ride on the ambulances and to be a firefighter. It's about 1.5 years or 2 years of schooling. And so to ask somebody to go get that, to come volunteer, like I said, we're having a hard time keeping people we pay part-time to do that.
Have we asked?
Not since I've been here. I will tell you, though, the statistic that's important is an NFPA study that says 40% of the country is covered by career departments. If you look in the percentage of the population, about 92% of the population, I think, is actually covered by career departments. So there is a lot of the country, like northern Nevada that has 300 people. You couldn't have a fire department. You couldn't afford to have a fire department. So there's a lot of the the rural part of the country and that's really where you tend to see the volunteers. In municipal cities, I know of one in Georgia that's all reserves, but that's because they're in metro Atlanta and they use Atlanta firefighters to cover their open shifts. I don't know of any municipal departments that have volunteers anymore. I'm not saying they don't exist. I don't know of any, and I travel the country a lot. The one where I came from, our neighboring department used to have them, and they got rid of them. They went to part-time and full-time only. So there's not very many. It's just because nationally it's been really hard for career departments to keep volunteers. We could always reach out, but again, like I said, they have to have the 2 years of training. They have to maintain their training, and they have to be available. That's the other problem we find is a lot of people that live in Boulder City work in Henderson and Las Vegas and stuff. And so when we have an emergency, we run into that same issue. We need them in the station right now. We don't need them to come in 20 minutes. And so if they're going to be here in 20 minutes, Henderson's going to be here in 18. We'll just take Henderson. And so that just creates a struggle. Like I said, I'd love to have 100 volunteers if that was a thing. I haven't seen it work in the country anywhere that I've been. So.
Well, according to the National Fire Department Registry here in Nevada, 54.7% of the departments are all volunteer. 25.6 are mostly volunteer. 8.1 are mostly career, and 11.6 are full career. And I do understand that if you talk about percentage of departments versus percentage of population, that's going to be a significant difference. If we're talking about the Mina Fire Department, all 3 of them may be able to respond at a given time, but that's still only going to be 3 individuals.
Yeah, and for example, when we had the box truck crash with the 5 fatalities and the 3 criticals, Searchlights, the Clark County volunteers did respond. We had 2 people show up. That's all they could muster that day. I mean, we had training going on that day. We had our office staff. We had our duty guys. I think we had 13 or 14, and we still didn't have enough. And so that's the problem you run into. I know when we go on the other side of the park, across the Tillman Bridge, when they have a bad wreck, the nearest fire department is Dolan Springs, and sometimes they get somebody, but a lot of times they don't have anybody to send. And so that's just where you run into it. And again, it's a decision for council again is that risk, the possibility that nobody's going to show up, worth it? I mean, and that's the struggle. It's most cities have decided that's too big of a risk because they don't have the same people that were available in the past to do jobs. I mean, to come in and do that volunteer stuff.
Right. I mean, if a person makes a decision to live in Searchlight, they need to understand that the closest fire department to them is going to be us, 40 miles away, 45 miles away from them. There is no fire department in Searchlight.
Well, I believe Clark County has a volunteer unit there. But again, it's based on whoever happens to be at home.
Right. I mean, there are no full-time firefighters for the community of Searchlight.
I believe you're correct.
Yeah. Over the past 5 years, how many positions have been added to the fire department?
3. What?
Sure. We were also lost positions, and so I don't know in the 5 years if we've actually gained any or gotten back to where we were.
So they saying they lost positions prior. They added 3 in December of 2019 or October of 2019. They believe they might have just been recovering what they had lost before.
Yeah, I believe there were positions reduced after the Great Recession or in response to that. And then, as the chief said, 2019, council voted to add 3 positions, which is a 10% or more increase in number of personnel. Plus, there's been a reworking of the staff, right? We have assistant chief now. We've returned to having captains for each of the platoons. Is that right?
So the positions were the last administration had eliminated the positions that we put back in there, and they were creating different positions. The full-time equivalent, the same number of people are in the office today they're just structured differently. He had an idea of having 2 captains at the station at the same time, and just some differences in not having any chiefs, and so we kind of put it back to the kind of industry best practice model. I'm not sure what he was doing.
Pretty much the way it was before.
There's
a captain for each platoon.
There's 1 captain for each shift right now.
There's a chief, an assistant chief,
a deputy chief, and we used to have a biller. Now instead of a biller, we have a data analyst. So same people, same number of people, just different titles on them.
Okay. Within the risk assessment that you did, there's quite a bit of reliance on information coming out of Heron's formula.
So when you do risk assessment, typically you can use a 2-axis probability and consequence model or a 3-axis model, which is probability, consequence, and impact on daily staffing. And so that third 3-axis model uses Heron's formula, and all that does is to create a visual polygon so you can see visually how big of risk is it. It's just a visual aid. As far as the numbers that we use, that helps us understand risk a little bit. Probability and consequence is just tougher because it doesn't speak to anything else. So when we do our model, we go deeper than that. And if you look in the risk assessment, we break down one of those legs and we look at what's the impact on our community, what's the impact on our staffing. We look at loss of life. We look at other things instead of just saying, could it happen and how bad will it be? Well, how bad is so subjective. It really bad, kind of bad. We try to break it down and quantify that a little bit to say, well, for our community, obviously, losing 1 or 2 people, that's terrible, and losing 5 is really, really bad. We try to break it down some way like that so we have something to go off of. Other bigger community or like community disruptions. If we lose, I don't know, the road coming in over here off of Railroad Pass, that bridge, if we lose that bridge, what impact is that going to have on us, to our tourism? And so we try to look at those kind of things. What's going to take a year to fix it? And, financially, there's going to be a big cost. So that has a higher would have a higher score if we.
I understand that. I'm just not used to seeing that formula used in that way for statistical analysis. It's a geometric formula for determining the square inch, square foot, square mile of a polygon. So I've not seen that used in a statistical method analysis before.
Yeah, so it was added to the Center for Public Safety Excellence, added it to their standards probably about 8 years ago. Prior to that, it was just the 2-axis. And they figured that they wanted to get a little bit deeper, a little bit more data. And like I said, the actual polygon way at the end, that's just for a visual aid as far as that's what they use it for, but as far as the calculations, they use that to help come up with your number. So.
Okay, I don't know that Heron visualized that back when he was talking with Socrates, but.
Yeah. We weren't happy when they first introduced it because it's really a pain to use it, to be honest with you. It's a lot of work.
Well, I passed geometry, but not well.
Yeah.
Statistics I did a little better at. Over the past 5 years, again, we looked at the numbers that you had provided. What do you see in those numbers over the past 5 years that says we're in real danger here and we need this? We need to add a significant number of people to this labor force, and we need to invest in new equipment, new buildings, all of that.
So it depends on what we're speaking of. So when we were talking about hazmat.
Well, number of calls.
So the calls aren't the driving force here. The distance to our calls, the location of our customers, of our residents, that's the driving force here. When we looked at that GIS model, and I'll be honest, when I moved here, I'm the fire chief. I moved here. I looked at homes over on the lakeside. I didn't think about distance to the fire station. I was looking for nice homes. I just assumed when I first got here, seems like a small town, everything's fine. It wasn't until we did this analysis that we thought, well, there's a whole bunch of area that's outside of the city. You know, we had heard there was a previous analysis done by the International Association of Firefighters a number of years ago, but not to this level. And we wanted to reserve our decisions until we actually ran it ourselves. And so we ran the studies, and that's when we saw where it was. And so the driving force is we have 50% of our population that lives outside of our areas that we consider a safe area, a safe zone. And so that's the driving force. You know, but then we look at the specific.
Well, let me, see if I can understand that a little better. When you say there's that number of people living outside the safe zone, does that mean they're unsafe? They're at risk?
They're at increased risk, absolutely. So
okay, increased risk.
Increased risk from the people that live within that 4-minute travel distance. So yes, so when we look at our NFPA statistics, our flashover, our cardiac arrest survival, based on my knowledge of the model, it would say that if you live within that 4 minutes, you have a better chance of a successful outcome than if you live outside of it. I will say if you live 10, 12 minutes away and you have a cardiac arrest, that's a bad situation. The outcome, chance of that's really
well,
poor.
Again, if you're going to have a heart attack, the best place to do it would be in an emergency room. I mean, that's...
Ideally.
But that's unlikely to happen. And, another thing that I had looked into was the number of fire stations in the valley, and only Henderson and North Las Vegas had something where they listed the number of stations. North Las Vegas has 8 fire stations, which breaks down to roughly 1 per 30,000 population. And Henderson has 11 stations, which breaks down to roughly 1 station for every 29,000 in population. So again, I don't know what their numbers look like as far as being within that 4-minute window, but what I'm getting at is the 4-minute is the ideal. But if you live at 4 minutes and 55 seconds away, it's not that you're under life-threatening. It's just you're not within the ideal range.
I guess I would.
And there's no community that really has everyone living within the ideal range. I mean, it's just not possible.
Yeah. Henderson's accredited. So I know Henderson has a risk assessment model. I know Clark County was. I think North Las Vegas went through the process at some point. So I know they have a risk assessment. So, I mean, we could obviously look at that. But again, it goes to me, that one of the things that's important is in Metro Vegas, those fire departments all respond together. And so where Henderson might not be able to get to a fringe, Clark County can, or Vegas can. And they cover each other's, through agreements, they cover each other's spaces. So a lot of times you might go to a fire and you'll have 2 Henderson units and you'll have a Clark County unit and a Las Vegas because they all can respond together and cover each other's gaps. We don't have that luxury because the benefit of being in Boulder City is we're away from all that. The negative is we're away from all that. And so we don't have that rapid response from all different angles. You know, especially when you get on would be the west side of Henderson. You have Henderson on one side, you have, you know, in some places Vegas, some places Clark County, you have fire trucks. I think Clark County has 40 fire stations. You know, and then granted, there are some of those that are way up, one up in Mesquite and one out in Laughlin, but they have a lot of stations. And Las Vegas, I think, has another 25 or so. So there's a lot of fire stations in that metro area that are covering each other's gaps. So I agree. I don't know that any city has them all covered, but they have other people covering them. We just don't have anybody covering us. I mean, we're like I said, the benefit of being out here is we're by ourselves. That's also one of the negatives.
And another concern I have with the Hemingway location, you know, it certainly provides greater access to the Hemingway Valley. But when we talk about having a truck or ambulance respond from that location over to Del Prado, there are not very many direct routes. As a matter of fact, there's only one route, which is to come up Nevada Way, then circumnavigate around the park here or over on Park Street or something.
Sure.
It does not provide very good access outside of the Hemingway Valley area, whereas a station that would be down around the library, you've got Adams Boulevard, you've got Georgia Avenue, you've got San Felipe. You have a number of routes that can be taken that would provide that. And as far as the Hemingway Valley goes, they already have one of the most direct routes from our existing fire station, which is Buchanan, right on out to Boulder City Parkway. So again, I'm concerned of, you know, yeah, we could provide very good levels of response times to Hemingway Valley, but that's about all that station would be able to do.
Yeah, and I think when we went out last week, I went out with the Public Works Director after visiting with Brock Armentrout about where's city locations, where's utilities. The place that we thought on that side that was the most ideal was right there at Quartzsite in Nevada Way. There's a location where all the utilities are there. It's right up by Temple Rock, so it's partway up the hill. It seemed like that would give us a little more in that 4-minute range inside of Del Prado. But you're right, there's nowhere that's going to
get us. There's no direct route from there to Del Prado.
But the study shows that we would get into the beginning, part of Del Prado we can get into in that 4-minute travel time from there. So, and I will say the interesting thing, we drove, some of them we got out and physically drove, like we drove from the fire station up to the Lake Mountain Estates, and it was 12 minutes driving posted speed limit. Now we can go a little bit faster, but we can't go a lot faster because the fire trucks don't stop real easy and turn real easy. And so it was about a 12-minute drive from the station all the way into the back of that trailer park. And so, and it was just, we were just curious because we wanted to see if those numbers looked about right, and they do. And we also did a study where we looked at response times by neighborhood zone for the last year, and consistently our response times, total response time from the station to most of them up along that lakeside were in that 12-minute range, 12 and a half minute range. And so we saw some in Del Prado, and then it comes down a little bit when you get over to San Felipe. But they're all, that whole area is significantly outside that range. And again, we're doing other things to bring that down, but the travel time, there's nothing we can do to bring the travel time down. I mean, we never encourage them to drive faster or unsafe, so that we can say pick a better route, that can speed up a little bit, but at the end of the day, the distance is what it is. So, and that's really where we're at, and that's kind of why we came to the council to share the problem and then hope we can come up with a good solution to fix the problem.
Did you take the time from that location in Hemingway out to locations, say, at Del Prado and Utah Street, or?
No, we could do that. We didn't. we were actually going up there to do an assessment, and so because we were going up there, we decided to time it just to see. We're heading that way anyway. But as far as going out and just driving them, we could definitely do it. We just didn't do it.
Well, again, my concern is that when you look at the distances, it doesn't appear to be a far distance. But when you look at what route you're going to have to take to get there, I don't see where a Hemingway station is going to improve the response times very much at all.
To Del Prado, not a lot. It just hits as that western edge. You're right. I mean, and so we had that conversation. Obviously, we're not trying to, I don't want you to think I'm asking for the world, but one of the things we did talk about is down the road, we could take an existing ambulance, if we had a location over there and put it over there with the existing crew and capture some of that. We've tried to say, if we could fix one of the two problems, what's our biggest problem? And we looked at the number of people, we looked at the number of homes, we looked at demographics, and that's kind of how we try to make that decision. They're both concerns. I mean, so again, we weren't trying to come in and say we need 2 fire stations and 6 of those and 3 of those. We were trying to be realistic and ask for something that's doable, but I'm open for more discussion, and we can do some more data analysis. We can go out and drive some things, whatever the council would like. Get in touch with us, email us. We're happy to go out and dig more. I know this isn't a really fast answer. So, I mean, we're happy to continue to look at it. I mean, it's been a problem that I believe has been here for a long time, and so we're just trying to start working on a solution for that.
Okay. Another factor that really hasn't been brought out in much of this is the airport. The number of flights in and out of there, the amount of activity there, and right now it's the taxpayers of Boulder City that pay for the firefighting responses for that airport. The airport users don't contribute at all to any of the fire protection that they have from the existing station. Is that correct?
I'm not sure.
Well, it's an enterprise fund, so
Okay.
they don't let you take any of the money out of that to pay for services they use.
Sure.
Do you know if there is a need for firefighting equipment, personnel at the airport, if the FAA will allow revenue raised on the airfield to be used for that, or is that still going to be the city's problem, the taxpayers' problem?
I know if it's an indexed airport, the FAA will pay for it, but ours is not an indexed airport. I don't know if they would allow them to use revenues on the enterprise funds. I'm not sure on that. We could definitely look into it, but I know if it's an indexed airport. So Pueblo Airport, where I came from, so Boulder City Airport has about 120,000 operations a year. Pueblo Airport had about 160,000. We were in Index B, but we had a commercial flight 3 times a day, a small Embraer. And because of that, they paid for a fire station and paid towards the staffing, and they bought the trucks and to maintain that index. Again, since it's not an indexed airport, I think it falls into a different category, and so I don't know if it would. But my recommendation would never be to put a full-time, if we ever got to the place where we thought we needed protection out there, would never be to put a full-time 24-hour day. I don't think that's a need out there.
Well, as I have said, people need to look at the master plan that's being implemented at the airport, because within that master plan is a fire station.
Yeah, I know we discussed it, and if we ever got to a place where where that was a serious discussion, is our recommendation.
Well, the discussion's already occurred. I mean,
Okay.
It's in the master plan.
So my recommendation would be is they make a small rapid response vehicle foam truck that we would recommend as a fire department that it would be staffed with 2 people, 40 hours a week, and that's it. Not around the clock, because we don't have a big nighttime presence at the airport. We would look at our peak demand time, and that's something we can do with our data, is say, when are we busiest? When do we have the most flights? When is the risk the greatest? And then we figure out a way to staff with a limited staffing to reduce that risk only. It wouldn't make sense. And Pueblo ran into this problem is they didn't have flights at night. So they had 3 firefighters that slept all night out there. Well, that didn't make any sense. And so, but because it was an indexed airport, they had to maintain that. And so, again, we're not in that boat. But like I said, if we ever felt a need because of the number of flights, and we have a lot of flights and we have a lot of passengers, if we ever felt that was a need, there's a way to do that without putting a full-time station and around-the-clock staffing. I think, from my position, I think that would be a waste of funding. And again, I know that might not be popular from some people, but I wouldn't recommend us to waste money.
Well, as I say, it's part of the plan. Councilmember Jorgensen?
Though I understand that we have to look at what ifs, I think we need to look at what is. And the airport is way outside the parameters of what is right now for that. Even though there is a plan, it doesn't mean that it's going to be implemented or put into place. So I currently look at what is, and you said that's 39 homes outside of the 4-minute response time. That's what you said, right?
3,900?
3,900.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, what did I say, 39?
You did.
Sorry,
I know what you meant.
3,900. You can't see what I wrote down. 3,900 homes. So that is what is. And there's no one specific spot that we could place a station that would mitigate all of those.
No, unfortunately, because our city's kind of shaped like a Y. Mm-hmm. And kind of how it kind of splits there around Nevada Way and goes, again, we tried to look and tweak and, yeah, I mean, I feel like the best place would be right at the top of Nevada Way for that lakeside, because then it would be able to get into Del Prado a little bit faster. There's just, I don't know where there's land that we could put a station right on top of the hill. I mean, that would be ideal. So we were trying to find something. That's why we're quartzite kind of, well, we don't want to go all the way down to Hemingway, and we want to be a little bit closer, and as much as we can fudge this way to get a little bit more of the historic area. Yeah, there's not, to my knowledge, a place that we can put just one and get it all. I mean,
okay.
And some people would even say, well, could you move the one you have? The one we have needs to be where it's at, because if you look at the mapping and stuff to get to the veterans home, which is one that we go to a lot, and all the other communities, it's covered. I mean, it needs to maintain coverage. We would be exposing them to, so making one problem to fix another problem.
And so your recommendation, you have two recommendations actually. The one you said covers 1,900 homes and one covers 1,400 homes. So the first one, the one down off of Lakeside, would cover 1,900 homes in that time, and the one by the library, 1,400. So would your number one recommendation then be down Lakeside?
It would, but it would be, when we ran those numbers, we ran it from the Chamber of Commerce location.
Okay.
If we re-ran it from Quartzsite or higher up the hill, that number would increase, because we would be capturing more homes in Del Prado. I don't know how much it would increase, but it would definitely increase. We would have to run the data and then see what.
I myself feel like 3,900 homes outside are way too many. Mm-hmm. That's my personal opinion on that, because I wouldn't want to be one of those 3,900 homes. I don't believe that you do consistently look at how many minutes you are from a fire station. And you probably don't realize that risk, right? But with the population that we do have an at-risk population nearer to the end of life as opposed to the beginning. And so I don't know. I think that's a number I'm not comfortable with, 3,900 homes outside of that response time.
Yeah, as I said in my council briefs, the only thing that keeps me awake at night is that. I mean, I have full confidence in my firefighters. I love the city I work in. I love the people I work for. That's what keeps me up at night. As honestly, I know we have areas that we can't sufficiently cover with our resources, and that's why I'm here, is to hope that we can, like I said, we can find a solution to fix that.
Because if you even have two people, right, in that home, you're looking at almost 8,000 people. Mm-hmm. And if we are 16,000, that's over half our population that isn't within that time. Am I correct?
Oh, so it'd be 4,474 residents is what we calculated on it.
Okay, 4,000.
Oh, you mean out of both of them?
Yeah, for
both. Yeah, both of them were close to a little over 7,000.
Because that's what we're looking at right now. We don't have coverage in either of these areas right now.
Correct.
The solution is to try to find some coverage.
Correct.
That would, so right now we're looking at 8,000 residents out of 16 maybe, or depending on which census, if you believe the census, that's a 50% of our population that is outside of the ideal, granted, response time, but I'd like to be within the ideal response time, and I am. And I care about the people that are outside.
Councilmember Bridges?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess I'm beyond the should we. I go back to those 6 potential solutions. Because I know people who live up in that 55 and over area on Lakeside. And those are smaller manufactured homes, very close together. They're higher risk to burn the way you were talking about, and they're also higher risk to need medical intervention.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so, and I also like the idea of where you're talking about in terms of where being located in order to meet that. Not that there is also now a needed population at Del Prado, but I'm thinking about the manufactured home park up there. Okay, so you talked about the 6 options, and I know that our ARPA funds have been sliced and diced like a pie a number of times and looking at what's accepted, not, and whether we need another health service. I'd be interested in finding out what the cost would be of some of the different options. If we're not looking at 3 and maybe 6, but and maybe we don't need a whole new commercial fire station. But I know you talked about a residential structure that might be able to be something built alongside of whoever comes in and builds more houses for us. Or a new modular fire station, or even a temporary double-wide mobile home somewhere that would fit in, to our need to cover those people. Because when you say 4,474 people are going to be better served, if 100 people are better served, and that's very important. And I think a lot of people live where they, especially in the manufactured homes and the 55 plus areas, people live where they can afford to live. People don't, not everybody has the option to move somewhere and say, gee, I want to be X distance from the closest school, fire department, grocery store. People who live here are living where they can best afford to live. And we do have areas that are not effectively covered. And yes, it could be that it doesn't show itself as an issue a year from now. But when that call comes in, I want to know that the people up there are going to have the same amount of response time as I am.
Yeah.
And so I would be interested in finding out what the costs of those different 1, 2, 4, and 5 would be.
Okay. Well, definitely.
And also, you were saying that you'd have 3 years on that safety. Is that what it is?
On the SAFER grant?
The SAFER grant.
Yeah, it's a staffing for adequate fire and rescue, I think is what it's called.
I'd rather see us apply for it, and in the long run, if it turns out that it's not something everybody has an appetite for, that we've gone through that process, because I understand what the grant.
Yeah, that seems like the wisest, just because we can always say no, but if we don't ask for it, it will definitely be no. And if we decide to go forward, then we just lose that. So, and I honestly, if we're not looking at the public health building option, I think number 2 is the smartest option. I did some research, and Storybook or somebody similar builds big enough homes. If you had a 4-bedroom, 3-bath home with a big 2-car RV garage, you could put fire trucks in them. And the only difference, they have to be sprinkled. There's a few things with the laws require. We'd have to sprinkle it. But then if it ever came that we didn't want it to be there, it's a house. The other thing is it looks like the other houses in the area, so it's not an eyesore. It fits in, so, and cost-wise, that option versus commercial is significantly cheaper.
Mm-hmm. Because it wouldn't need to necessarily be a full-service fire station. It would be a place where you'd be able to access somebody who, whether there's a fire or whether there's a medical need, you'd be closer, and they'd be able to be reached in 4 minutes rather than 10.
Yeah, it'd be a satellite fire station. It'd be their other stuff, their classroom, the training that is at Station 121. So that, I mean, we wouldn't need to have all that stuff on it. It wouldn't have to be a big concrete block building. It could be. So there are good options, and we'll work on getting some estimated numbers. Again, we wanted to have this meeting and discuss with council before we started going down those roads to even get. So that'll be the plan, is to start working on some of those, and maybe we'll get something on the council agenda in the future and have a conversation.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Adams?
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to thank you for bringing this forward. You know, you've identified, where the community's risk is at, and that's really the first step in us being able to even address the situation. So I do want to thank you for bringing that forward. I think with all the information that we have now, it would be irresponsible of us to just stop the conversation there. I think there is a lot still to be discussed. You know, it all comes down to, what can we reasonably afford to do? And, of course, we've all kind of joked about it. We'd love to have a paramedic for every family in Boulder City. Wouldn't that be great? But there are things that are within our reason, and there are things that are not. So I think it would be important also for us to continue to reach out with other community stakeholders like the hospital, to see what their needs are, to see where we can best partner, because as we learned, fire department is going to often have to, hopefully less often than what we've had to do, but to partner with the hospital, to partner with Southern Nevada Health District, making sure that we've kept those communications open so that we can see what is possible, what our needs are, if they are there, if they aren't there, so that we can make the best decision up here on what is the most appropriate way for us to move forward. And in the end, if going forward with this would be the we're looking to have a permanent solution, so it should really be, there's no real room for error in my mind for what we decide to do. We have to do the best that we can with everything. So that's my thoughts on this matter. So again, I appreciate you bringing this forward for us to discuss.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I will just say one thing, that we do have an airport. It is in the master plan for a fire station at that airport. It is billed as the third busiest airport in the state of Nevada. Again, when we talk about where we're going to do these things, it's important, I think, to look to the future and say, this needs going to come to pass at a foreseeable time. The other thing is, again, I recognize the work that our fire department has done over, we're now getting into 2 years. It's been outstanding. We even got yelled at a little bit by some of the others that we got too far out in front of the rest because of the efforts we were making here. It's a great job. We certainly need to look at these assessments. I do have some questions about some of these numbers with people, population figures, but we can certainly look at that in the future. I do appreciate you bringing this forward. With that, if there's nothing else, we will move to our final public comment period.
Thank you.
Anyone in council chambers that would like to speak in the final public comment period? Comment during this period may be on any issue, and you will have up to 5 minutes to speak. All right, seeing no one come forward, we will go to call in. Anyone wishing to call in for the final public comment period, the phone number is 702-589-9629. Again, this is the final public comment period for the City Council workshop. Anyone wishing to call in, the phone number is 702-589-9629. Madam City Clerk, did we have any comments that have been emailed prior to the meeting?
No comments were received.
Thank you. All right, hearing no one then for public comment, we will close the public comment period, and we are adjourned. Again, thanks to everyone for contributing.